Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ANU Alumni Impact Maker series hosted by the ANU LGBTIQA Alumni Network, the next big fight political activism, and the Australian LGBTIQA community. Just in case you have not attended any of an alumni webinar before, I will quickly run through some housekeeping items. All attendees have your video and microphones turned off. This helps to keep the sound quality clear and reduce interference on the call. If you would like to ask a question throughout the event today, I will encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or facing technical issues, please email alumni@anu.edu.au and the team will assist. And last but not least, please note that this webinar is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please email alumni@anu.edu.au for further assistance. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the LCT, the Ngunnawal people, and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of the city where I'm currently based. So I would encourage you to do the same if you are not based in the LCT. Moving forward, I would also like to acknowledge our LGBTIQA elders, past and present, and express my gratitude for the recognition and acceptance of the LGBTIQA community experience today, and acknowledge the battles they have fought and our sorrow for the prejudice they have experienced in order for us to be where we are today. So most of you here probably because of the invitation from the network itself, or you might have, gone to the website and found out about this event. So to begin, I would like to introduce you the network. The ANU LGBTIQA Alumni Network's mission is to foster community among and build strong connections between ANU LGBTIQA alumni and students, staff, faculties, parents, and straight allies through an intersectional lens. So we do this through a mix of social and networking nights, thought leadership discussions such as this panel, representation and advocacy for our community on campus, in the wider Canberra community or around the world. So today, we are very lucky to have Toby be our moderator for the panel today. So Dr. Toby Evans, who uses he, they pronouns, is a diversity and inclusion expert with a PhD in cultural studies from ANU. While completing his PhD, he received awards for his research on gender and Game of Thrones from the ANU Gender Institutes and the Popular Culture Association / American Culture Association. He is currently focusing on LGBTIQA advocacy and gender equality in local government, where he works across policy, consulting, advocacy, training, and organizational development. He is also a passionate educator and has 7 years experience delivering training, learning design, mentoring, and facilitation. And last but not least, his first book based on his doctoral thesis is currently being revised for publication with Liverpool University Press. Toby, I will pass it to you.
Thanks, Jacob, and welcome everyone to this fabulous panel today. I'm so excited to be moderating, which is, I think, the best job because I just get to sit here, be pretty and be nosy, which is two of my greatest strengths, I think. So I'm really honoured to introduce our panel to you. So we're going to have some quick introductions and then we're going to segue into our questions. And we're going to have time for questions from the audience as well, as we've mentioned. So if you have a question at any point, please put it in the Q&A function or in the chat, and we will answer you towards the end. So our starting panelists for today, our first one is Dr. Clara Tuck-Meng Su. So he's a GP who has continued to live and work in Canberra since completing her grad dip at ANU. Clara is now the practice principal of the Hobart Place General Practice and its Canberra General Practice. Dr. Su has worked with many vulnerable communities in the ACT, in particular, the LGBTIQ community and people with drug dependencies, which she received a Medal of the Order of Australia in 2015, which is just incredible. Dr. Sue joined a select group of trans medical practitioners when she went through a gender affirmation process herself in 2018 to 2019. She took a stand against the elevation of Mrs. Margaret Court to a Companion of the Order of Australia in the Australian Day Honours in 2021 by returning her ANU protest. We love to see it. Amazing. And Clara, we're so happy to have you here. Our next panelist is Lynne Gordon, who is a non-binary science communicator with a background in chemistry. They've presented science shows across Australia with Questacon and worked with the ABC as the 2021 Darren Osborne Regional Science Cadet in their spare time. They run a podcast called Queer STEM History, which aims to highlight historic and inspirational queer role models in the world of STEM. And thank you so much for joining us, Lynne. And last but certainly not least, we have Kat Reid, who is a human rights advocate, community builder, avid intersectional feminist, and political performance artist. They were recently recognised as the 2021 Young Campus Citizen of the Year. Kat's leadership experience is diverse. They've held positions of leadership in both local and national organisations, including the ANU Students Association, and led the Australian Queer Students Network as the national co-convener. Kat was a council member on the ACT LGBTIQ Ministerial Advisory Council and advised on issues affecting queer youth. So that's our amazing panellists for today. Now we're going to move it to our questions. So our first question for everyone today is around heroes, trans heroes. So in the LGBTIQ community, we often talk about the idea that if you can't see it, you can't be it. Now, with that in mind, I'd love for everyone to share with us who your favourite real-life transgender and or gender diverse hero is, whether they're from the past or the present. So firstly, I'd like to start with Kat.
Hello, and thanks, Toby. I'm excited I get to kick this question off because there are so many heroes. But the one I'm going to talk about today is Alok, who is a non-binary person of colour who is a writer, an artist, and is a public figure at the moment as well. And the reason why I chose them is because they're doing some really interesting work around deconstructing gender expression. And as a person of colour myself, a non-binary person of colour, I find it really difficult to find role models for what being a non-binary person of colour can look like. For those who don't know, there is a little bit of I guess a trend, I don't know what you would call it, but a lot of non-binary people are quite often white and quite skinny as well. And there's kind of a perception that that sort of thin androgyny is what non-binary is and how to express non-binary. Whereas for me, like, I am a person of color, I'm curvy, I choose to present very feminine. For me, there is no mold on what that looks like. And oftentimes, because there isn't an awareness of what a non-binary person of color can look like, I think I often get feminized, or I get, like, people assume that I am cis female because I express feminine, and because I think a lot of times being a person of color can mean that you fall into very conventional ideas of masculinity and femininity for a lot of people. Like, we don't really have an understanding of what androgyny, true androgyny, looks like. So Alok is sort of my hero because I think they really are at the forefront of deconstructing that and talking about it. And they're just an incredible artist as well. And as an artist myself, I just really look up to people who can kind of express political and theoretical ideas of gender expression through art.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I love Alok. They're an incredible artist. I remember I was walking to the shops once and I had just read some of their poetry and I was just like thinking about it. I was like, man, wow, like this one line, it was just incredible. And if anyone hasn't seen Alok's Instagram, highly recommend it. Absolutely stunning. And I love the way that they talk about gender and race, you know, and like things like hair, and it's just like so rich and gorgeous. So thank you so much, Kat, for bringing them into this conversation. The next person I'd like to hear from is Clara.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you for inviting me on your panel today. I don't often talk about heroes because I think for me, you know, it can be really misleading elevating someone to hero status, because you know, in a common mind, you know, heroism is often associated with perfectionism, and I think that's often unfair on the person that we actually idolize, you know, as well as the expectations we actually put on them. And now that we, in a socially media aware world, we hear a lot more about some of the intimate details of the people we actually up in the media. And we now realize that we are all human beings with our strengths and our flaws, and so hero worship sits slightly uncomfortably with me. And I think often in my work, now I would say the greatest heroes I come across are the people who do the hard yards on an everyday basis, the people who do the little things that make life better for the people around them and never get any recognition for that. Having said that, since I've been asked this question, I thought there were a couple of people I was going to nominate. One is from the past, Lily Alba, who was really the first person that we know of in the Western world who actually went through a surgical male to female transition. I mean, in the 1930s. I mean, what a brave thing to do at that time, when being transgender was completely unheard of, and also to actually subject herself to an operation like that, for which there was no precedent. So I think amazingly, and I think she's amazing for actually, I mean, even if she eventually died of surgical complications, she showed the way and showed us, I suppose, a new reality that we can all aspire to. So in continuing sort of the same vein, my next hero I was going to nominate is not actually a transgender person at all, and he won't be here. Is Dr. Kieran Hart, who's actually a urologist who's working in Canberra and who's actually providing the male to female transgender surgery in Canberra. And the reason I nominate him is because he's actually pioneered a new form of gender affirmation surgery for people who are seeking male to female gender affirmation in Australia, called peritoneal pull-through vaginoplasty. Now this was first done by a plastic surgeon in New York about 3 to 4 years ago, when a transgender surgeon of his requested that. And to my knowledge, Dr. Hart's the first person that's actually done it in Australia. Of the patients of mine who have actually seen him had a surgery done, it all seems to be very successful. And this will probably gradually become the standard form of surgery in Australia, especially for younger people who started transitioning early. So I think, I think my hat off to him for being brave enough to actually do that.
Thanks, Clara. And I think that's like so exciting that pioneering work is like also happening in Australia. And I think
and in Canberra.
Yeah, well, of course, Canberra, queer capital of Australia. Love it. No, thank you, Clara. And lastly, but definitely not least, I'd love to hear from Lynne.
Thanks, Toby. And again, thank you so much for having me on the panel. And for this question in particular, I'm pretty excited about it because it's kind of like one of my areas of interest with the podcast I made, Queer STEM History, with my friend Laura. It's all about looking about these queer heroes throughout history. And I thought it was kind of thing like, you don't hear about these people, but I found out there are so many people. And the podcast is currently on hiatus, but I've got a document probably like several pages long, maybe almost 100 people. I'm like, oh, wow, there's so many people to talk about. So nailing it down to just one or two was kind of hard, but I do have one special in my heart, which was one we have made an episode on, which is Dr. Ben Barris, who was a neuroscience in America and a trans man. And just when I was researching and getting to record this episode, the whole time I was vibing. I was very excited about talking about someone who had an experience so close to mine, reading his autobiography. I'm like, wow, this sounds so like to me, but also someone who I think I would call a hero because he's done so much amazing stuff, not just fighting for trans rights within the academic community, but also he was a really strong proponent of supporting mentor relationships in academia, making sure that supervisors do the good work for their students and help support them and foster their growth, as well as fighting sexism. He would use his experience, who was like, oh, well, this is how I was treated as a woman, and now I'm treated as a man so much better. This is objective evidence of how academia is discriminating, and then continuing to fight for that. So he's really strong for me. But on a more personal level, I have a closer hero, which is Dr. Tanya Junkers. During my honours year, I was very shy, very closeted, and very scared of the world, not feeling brave enough to come out. But in one of our first lab group meetings, she came to the university, was starting a lab group partnered with our lab group, and was just out and proud trans woman, putting trans flags and memes at the end of her presentation. And I was just
love it.
being someone in my community that I could go, oh, things are going to be okay. So those are my heroes.
That's so great, Lynne. Thank you for sharing both of those. And I think that what you touched on there with the importance of mentorship is so important, because as we know, a lot of trans people struggle to find employment, especially in ongoing employment. So I think like having people you can look up to, people who are championing that, but also people who are making you feel, as you said, like it's okay to be yourself. Like that's so, I'm so glad to hear that you had that, especially at the ANU, like absolutely love it. Our next question is, as you know, this event coincides with Transgender Day of Remembrance on Saturday, the 20th of November. Could you please tell us what this day means to you and what or who you will be remembering? So for this question, I'd like to start with Lynne.
Thinking about Trans Day of Remembrance, the thing is remembering our history, everyone who's fought to get here so far, which makes me think of remembering basically my privilege. The life I've lived through has made it fairly easy for me to come out, transition, even though if there are roadblocks, there are people who are going through a lot harder. And so what I think of remembering is, while, the next big fight of where we need to go, we also need to keep in mind that even currently now, things that are easy for some of us, other people were fighting us. There's a quote that I thought of a lot, which is, what use is queer theory to the person who just got tossed out by her parents for being trans and is now homeless? It's a fight we need to make on multiple levels. We can't just look at the forefront. We need to keep fighting at all levels. So that's really what I'm remembering.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lynne. And I think that's really right in terms of that difference between lived experience and theory and ways of thinking about it, but also the real material consequences and the difference that people have in terms of being trans, in terms of different types of privilege. Next, I'd love to hear from Kat.
Thanks, Toby. And yeah, I definitely very much agree with Lynne here on the importance of history. But I've been having my own reflections this week, because this is Trans Awareness Week, and we end Trans Awareness Week with Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is actually quite a sad thing to end it with. But I sort of want to trigger warning the rest of what I'm going to say here. But it is a day for the community and for those outside of the community to remember the violence that has been perpetuated towards trans people, in particular trans women of colour. For those people who maybe don't know the history of Trans Remembrance Week, it was sort of created out of the murder of Rita Hester in the 1990s, I believe. She was an African-American woman whose murder is still unsolved to this day. And unfortunately, her story is only one of several that are constantly happening every year across the world and in Australia. So I think it's important to remember that while Australia and our community has made such huge leaps and bounds in the last few years to understand trans issues and the experience and to be welcoming, there are still so many people who are under our noses who are experiencing violence. But also, I think it's important to remember that violence can be direct and obvious, but it can also be really insidious. And it's the subtle discrimination every day. It's the bullying, it's the transphobia, it's constantly being left out. And these are the things that contribute to our community unfortunately having a statistic as high as 1 in 2 trans people considering committing suicide in their lifetime, which is quite sad. And really it comes down to the fact that even though we have some more awareness coming, it's still not getting through to the people who are the most vulnerable in our society, people of colour, people with disability, First Nations people. And really, if we want to understand a community, we need to understand the issues they experience and support the most vulnerable in our community before we can really see change.
Yeah, absolutely. Kat, thank you for putting that so beautifully. And I think you're very right, in that we need to make sure that we're being inclusive of everyone when we're thinking about trans awareness, trans inclusion, the trans community people have disabilities, we have people of color, we have Aboriginal people, we have, everyone is part of that community, and there's no point just doing trans inclusion for people who are white, able-bodied, things like that. That's not trans inclusion. Last but definitely not least, I'd like to hear from Clara.
Thank you, Toby. In a way, I think I'm probably echoing, what your other panelists have really said. But I would also like to say, that I'm really pleased that Jacob, in his introduction, referred to LGBTIQ elders, because for me, that's really a lot about what Trans Day of Remembrance is about. It's really about, the sacrifices they went through, the tough times they went to, to try to actually change the world, to be the world that we now live in. And while there's obviously a lot more that we could be doing now to make life equal for everybody, it's so much better than even something within living memory, within the world we live in now, for trans people is so different to the world just 20 or 30 years ago. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like, transitioning, 30, 40, 50 years ago. The amount of discrimination that I would probably have had to live with, the fact that I probably would not have been able to have the professional life that I have today. So I want to actually pay my respects to my LGBTIQ elders, and thank them all, for what they've done for us.
Very well put. Thank you, Clara. Our next question, kind of continuing that in terms of how we can continue that momentum and continue creating positive change, is what are your top 2 tips for allies who want to support the transgender and gender diverse community? So I'm going to start with Clara for this one.
I think as we heard from the other panelists as well, we still live in a world where there is transphobia, whether overt or covert, and it still affects us all in our everyday lives. So what allies can do for us, I think, is firstly to stand with us and show that they're standing with us. Because the more that the more we see of that, the more the easier it becomes, for us to actually negotiate our own internal struggles and to actually stand up for who we are. And as part of that, events like this, where people are able to actually come out and stand up for themselves, and as Lynne was sort of saying, when they actually had this mentor who stood up and showed them what was possible, that just makes I suppose the idea of the possibilities present in our mind. And also I think what allies can do is that they can help us to actually call out transphobia whenever they actually come across that. Because that then names it for what it is, and is then something we can do something about.
Yeah, and there's something really powerful in saying, actually that's transphobic, or actually that's homophobic, like really naming it. It's super powerful. Thank you, Clara. Next, I'd love to hear from Lynne.
The way I was thinking about this question was a bit more of a, I guess, not on the big fight, but on the, everyday level. And the 2 things I came was, one, just treat us like humans. We're just, we're just people. This is part of who we are, but it's not a big difference. One of my friends was telling me that sometimes people find out she's trans and go, yes, Queen Slay, girl boss. And it's like, well, would you do that to a normal person? And some were, well, no. That was very bad of me for saying no, but, do you do that to everyone? And like, similar, don't comment on people's bodies unless it's like something you'd do to anyone.
Yeah.
And for my second tip, I was like, just believe us when we say who we are. We've been thinking about this way longer than you'd think. And you don't have to fully understand someone to support them. You can just, take your time to learn, but just show respect first.
I think that's a great point, because so many people are learning, in this space. Like I teach LGBTIQ 101 all the time, and people are often like, I don't know how to not get it wrong. And I'm just like, just listen to people. They are who they say they are, and then just do what they ask you to do. You don't need to, have your own PhD in gender studies to be respectful. Right? Next, I'd love to hear from Kat.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that's been said already as well. And I really think that doing your research is really key. And, you know, you've kind of got a bit of an interesting line to walk there between, you know, lived experience is incredibly important, and you should always listen to lived experience, but you also don't want to, you know, exhaust the people in your life who are trans and, you know, rely on their emotional labor to understand their experience. And there are some fantastic websites out there. You know, you've even got local organizations like A Gender Agenda who have, they have groups for allies or friends and family. There's Meridian, who publish a lot of documents and, you know, explainers. There's the LGBTI Health Alliance. Like, there's a lot of other places you can go to get your research. And I think you've sort of got to understand and analyze the relationship you have with the people in your life you know are trans, and figure out whether or not the relationship you have with them is one where you can talk to them about their experience, or where, you know, maybe that's not appropriate, or, you know, maybe they're just not interested in having that conversation with you, and that's perfectly fine. I think as well, understanding that heteronormativity can be performative, and that you can unknowingly be performing heteronormativity without even being aware of it, and that can contribute to a lot of people feeling excluded. And, you know, I think a lot of people feel quite frustrated by that, but I think, again, you know, having knowledge and being self-critical and understanding, you know, what are the aspects of heteronormativity that there are out there, and how am I performing it in my daily life that is maybe making people feel uncomfortable, is really important. And look, at my second thing, I'm sorry, I'm going for a while here. When you get me going, I can just really keep talking. The second thing I wanted to say is, that Clara already said it, but it's join our fight. You know, it's still ongoing, and next week we've actually, there's a bill being reintroduced about the religious discrimination. And a lot of politicians are trying to push it through really quickly before the end of term. And so I would really recommend, you know, understand the issues that we're experiencing, sign the petitions, join the protests, or even if you don't want to be public about it, or you don't want to be that you know, in your face about it, I guess, find, you know, check in with your trans friends and see how they're feeling about it. Chances are they probably feel pretty distressed by the situation, and check in and see if there's anything you can do to support them through this time.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Kat. And Kat, could I ask you to just explain what heteronormativity is for anyone who's not sure?
Sure. What a big word.
Yeah, just a cool question.
Just a tiny one. I'll give it a go. So I guess heteronormativity is the set of things that we do as a culture in a society that contributes to this idea that queer people don't exist. So it's things like assuming that you can walk into any workplace and talk about your partner if you are straight, and that's just normal and everyone does it. Whereas for a queer person, that's actually probably a situation of a lot of anxiety for them in some cases, because they might not feel like they can be out. It is also, you know, it can occur in terms of assumptions. So a lot of people assume that I am cis and straight because of how I look. And so, you know, oftentimes I have to be correcting people all the time. That's an example of heteronormativity. I feel like, Toby, you can explain this a little better.
No, Kat, you've done a great job. And I think that you're very right. Like, when people make those assumptions about, you know, who you are, they're implying that you should be that way. You know, and whether they're not, they are actually meaning that or not, like, that's what you have to kind of then turn around and be like, actually no, and walk it back. So yeah, that's, you know, really great, like, point in terms of, you know, being mindful of heteronormativity, as you've so beautifully explained it for us, and how you can start to kind of unpack that in your own world. So our next question is about place. So as you know, gender is profoundly shaped by places, and the places that we live, the places that we go, and things like that. So thinking about the Australian context specifically, what does our country need to do better? And for this one, we're going to start with Kat.
Okay. So I believe that we need trans and gender diverse people in positions of leadership, in positions of influence. I think with, like I've sort of mentioned before, Australia's gone through this massive kind of boom of trans awareness. and trans stories are reaching the media more often, and more people are talking about, more people are coming out and feeling comfortable coming out, and more people are talking about, you know, being friends and knowing people who are trans in their life. But I think, unfortunately, I still feel as though the narrative around it is still very, it's kind of treating everyone like a spectacle. Like, we want to talk about your experience because you're trans, and that's interesting and that's fantastic. It's no, we haven't yet gotten to the point where trans people can be everyday people. We haven't got to the point where trans people can be valued in terms of people of worthwhile skills and influence in industries, in leadership, in political situations. And unfortunately, until we get to a point where we have people with lived experience in positions of leadership, we're always going to be pushing things from the bottom up, and change is going to be slow and frustrating and traumatic. So I truly believe that Australia needs to start having some really notable people, and there are some out there. There are definitely plenty of people out there who are doing the work, but we definitely need a bigger representation of those people. And look, I can rattle on about all sorts of rights that we need: gender neutral bathrooms, gender affirming treatments to be covered by Medicare, data collection as well, so we can appropriately fund services.
Yeah, give us data.
Yeah. Who would have thought actually knowing how many people it affects and what the issues are actually helps. But I think, you know, under the current government, there is definitely a resistance into, you know, collecting data and understanding queer people in general in Australia, but also trans and gender diverse individuals, because they don't want to fund it, because they want to live under the banner of ignorance, so that, you know, they don't have to acknowledge the fact that this is happening in the country. And look, First Nations people, statistically, we know they have much poorer health outcomes and life outcomes. So like, we need to be doing this work. This is all policy stuff that really the federal government and our local state governments should be taking responsibility for. But yeah, that's just some of the issues that I think we should address.
Amazing, thank you, Kat. Next, I'd like to go to Clara.
Well, where do we start and where do we stop, Toby?
We got all that.
I guess for me, you know, the first thing I would talk about, because it's such a large part of my work, you know, it's really about better access to gender affirming treatment, but especially for children and adolescents. And unfortunately, gender affirming treatment for children and adolescents are really at the forefront of the culture wars now. You know, you don't really see, you know, headlines in conservative papers really attacking gender affirming treatment for trans adults, because, you know, we can give consent to what we want and things like that. But there's all this questioning, you know, of the validity, you know, of giving treatment to children and adolescents, you know, and as I think Kat alluded to, you know, the mental health statistics, you know, for particularly for children and adolescents, are absolutely terrible. And when, you know, the people in that position get their gender identity questioned and have to justify it, it's very, very difficult and traumatic. And imagine having to go to court to actually ask for permission for treatment. So that's where I think, you know, we as a community really need to stand behind, you know, children and adolescents, you know, and really say that it's unacceptable for them to be used as pawns in the culture war. And obviously, you know, as part of that, you know, it's about Medicare-funded treatment, it's about better access to psychologists, you know, better access to surgery, a whole gamut of things really, you know, for children and adolescents. The other one I'm going to say, which is I think a little controversial, is in a way the discrimination within our own LGBTI community. Now, I lived until I transitioned, you know, in 2018, 2019, I lived as a effeminate gay Asian man. And I can tell you, you know, as an effeminate gay Asian man, that I knew that whenever I went to any gay venue in my 20s and 30s, that nearly everybody in that venue, I mean, I never encountered violence or anything like that, but nearly everybody in the venue was not interested in going out with me. You know, the ideal, you know, of if you like, the model of attractiveness for the gay community is actually a white Adonis. And unfortunately, that's still what we largely see in the media. So, we as part, and I guess this sinks into a conversation intersectionality. We need to see more models. We need to see a more diverse representation in the gay and lesbian media, the whole LGBTIQ media. So people of all shapes, colors, and sizes can be regarded as attractive models. Because if we only see one thing, that's what actually impinges on our consciousness. And this really came home to me when I was talking to a television producer about a program on bodies and things like that. And one of the women who's doing a research on the program talked about how the Kim Kardashian shape was now the desirable shape, for her daughter and teenagers in their late teens and so on. And I thought, but that shape is completely unattainable without surgery. And if the media can now make that shape, the desired shape for everybody, it just shows the power the media has. And we need to tell our media that there needs to be a diversity of stories that they should be telling.
Yeah, really great point, Clara. Thank you for talking about that one. And last, I'd love to hear from Lynne.
As Clara and Kat have said, there's like so much to this question
Yeah.
that we're talking about. And I thought I'd focus on thinking about access to community. Like in Canberra, we are really lucky. Like queer capital, yeah, we've got AGA, and we've also got like a lot of community groups specifically for trans people in Canberra to meet, socialize, do events. But talking to my friends around Australia, it's not really the same. The larger cities, the other capitals, they're too big, too spread out for people to really have these sorts of communities outside of universities. And smaller towns, there's a lower population. They tend to be more conservative. It's not safe. So we really need Australia to have more safe spaces for people to get together, find friends, share information about access to healthcare and doctors and queer-friendly places to work around Australia. But also beyond that, these kind of communities are not what everyone always needs. If the only thing bringing these people together is this immutable characteristic of we're all trans, sometimes you don't have that much in common. So other community groups like sports, hobbies, clubs, they need to really show that they're trans-friendly and welcoming. And like Clara was saying, even within the broader LGBTQIA plus community, there can be a bit of transphobia or not binary exclusion in these spaces. So we just need wider acceptance in community groups so people can feel safe to be out and make friends.
Thanks, Lynne. I think that's a wonderful point, and it's integral that we have those like trans-specific community spaces where we can see different ways of being trans. As Clara talked about, there's often kind of a very narrow vision of transness. But I think that we need those communities so we can see different versions of our possible selves. But also we just need other stuff as well, because as you wisely noted, Lynne, like being trans is not necessarily like something that you can build any kind of friendship or community on, because trans people are so different. Like we're a huge diverse group of people. Some people like sports, some people like sewing, some people like fashion, some people like dogs, like some people like all those things, some people like none of those things. Like there's so many different kinds of people, so we need to have access to all the spaces that anyone else would, as well, so that we can have those communities where we want and need them as individual people. Okay, so we're up to our final question. So just to the audience, if you've been kind of thinking of a question, I encourage you to start putting in the chat now, and we'll get onto your questions very soon. But my last question for our panelists is about joy. So as you know, a lot of narratives about transgender and gender diverse people in Western culture really center struggle and barriers and tragedy. So while it is really critical that we acknowledge and address these challenges, it's also really, really important that we make space in trans stories for joy, for pleasure, and for euphoria. So I'd love for everyone to share with us what is currently bringing you pleasure in the broadest sense of the word. And it could be something small, it could be something big, but I'd love to know what's bringing you joy at the moment. And I'd love to start with Clara.
Thank you, Toby. I think it's a great question because, as you say, so much of the trans narrative is really about, struggle, the discrimination we face, and so on. And it's so important to really acknowledge the positives in our lives, so that we don't see the black. Well, what's bringing me pleasure? I think one of the things I'm going to say is all the new girlfriends I have. It's interesting, you know. I said earlier, I've always been a feminine man. You know, I've never been particularly macho. And yet, you know, it's interesting that even as an effeminate gay man, you know, girls, you know, like I work with women and things like that, you know, and they're happy to talk to me, but somehow there was a bit of a barrier about, you know, really becoming a girlfriend, if you like. So I found, you know, that having transitioned, it's really nice, you know, that I now have women that I can be really good friends with, you know, and we can have girl talk, you know, and now I know this is very much stereotyping, you know, but it's really interesting, you know, how men and women talk differently and talk about different things, you know. Men just want to talk about issues, you know, and and as women and as trans people as well, I think, you know, we for a lot of us, our minds seem to work slightly differently, you know, and we are better, I suppose, at acknowledging and talking about feelings, you know, and how feelings impact on the world, you know, and not to dismiss the importance of issues, but you know, issues are important in how they mesh with feelings. And you know, so I'm really liking, you know, the friendships I've got, you know, and the conversation I'm having now. And I think the other thing that I want to say again is really about how important stories are. You know, the stories we tell each other, the stories, you know, that we read, you know, and positive stories, really, you know, about our experience, you know, and how great it is, you know, to really be able to own our identity.
Wonderful, thank you, Clara, and I'm so glad that you've got lots of lovely friends to have that beautiful girl talk with. I think that's so fabulous. Next, I'd love to hear from Kat.
Thanks, Toby and Clara. That sounds so much fun and so cute. Yeah, very happy to hear about all of your friends. Look, for me, so what brings me joy is working with the community and being in spaces with other trans people. I've sort of, so earlier this year, I worked with a group of trans people on, we believe, Australia's first trans musical. and it was really, really powerful, and so happy to be in a space where, you know, we didn't have to talk about trans issues all the time, but anytime someone did want to bring up something that was like a trans experience, we all got it. And we didn't like have to like dwell necessarily on like deconstructing it or like feeling sad about something. It was just kind of like, we gotcha, you know. And with this musical as well, like for those who don't know, that the voice is a particular experience for a lot of trans people. For some people it can be really it can kind of lead into their gender dysphoria a little bit pre-transition, and for a lot of people who you know, grew up singing and were singers, after transitioning they might have to retrain their voice. And so we did this whole musical specifically around trans joy and about singing and being honest about where your voice was at and how you felt about your voice. And it was just so fantastic to be with a group of people who were creating art and creating music without thinking about limitations and how, but also if they were, then it was fine and it was comfortable. We were in this space of people who all sort of felt the same without having to like discuss anything. Yeah,
that's like, it sounds absolutely incredible, Kat. I think if I had known that musical was coming to Canberra, I might have stayed. Yes. But no, it sounds amazing, and I think that like being surrounded by trans people is such a beautiful experience. Like I remember someone this year was talking about how like as a trans person I would just like always be outnumbered because trans people are like 1 in 100, so statistically usually. But I was like, but there's moments when you're not are so great. Like I'm part of a trans book club, and we meet monthly and talk about trans books, and it's just like so beautiful to be surrounded by trans people and trans voices as well. So yeah, like thank you for sharing that with us. It's something that is bringing me joy. And last, I'd love to hear from Len. What's making you happy at the moment?
What's really making me happy is I guess, finally being in a space where I'm unlearning a lot of these walls I've built up. Like I said at the very start of, used to being this very scared, shy person of feeling like the world was an unsafe place to be. But now I'm, out and proud in a fabulous workplace that supports me, and being happy with my body to a point that I can experiment a bit more with presentation, and unlearning that, avoiding feminine things or trying to draw between masculine things, and going, they're just things. I'm going to do what makes me happy, wear what makes me happy, refer to myself as what makes me happy, and shifting from gender dysphoria to that gender euphoria of just doing
Love
whatever.
it. That's awesome, Lynne. Thank you so much for sharing it. And I just say on a personal note, I think I met you fairly quite a few years ago now.
Yeah.
And like you then and you now is so different. So I'm so pleased that you've had the opportunity to grow so much and to see just the tiniest scratch of that for myself. I feel very lucky.
Oh,
all right. So now we're going to move into our audience questions. So our first question is, what common assumptions about gender do you regularly see or face? And do you have any recommendations on how people can change their thinking to reframe these conversations?
I have some thoughts, if that's all right.
Yep. Just so before you dive in, we might have one answer to each question just because we've got quite a few at this point. So Kat, please take this one away. And if anyone obviously has a burning feeling, firstly, there is a cream. But secondly, you can just also say, oh, I want to answer that one too. So go, Kat.
So for me, I still feel like we haven't really gotten around this idea that gender expression does not equal gender identity still. The experiences I have constantly is just, I think I've mentioned it before, that like I am a feminine person. People often want to know what I was assigned as at birth, but to me that's quite irrelevant because I'm like, I am non-binary. I experience my gender. My internal experience of my gender is not gendered. It exists outside of male or female. But yes, I do present quite feminine, and I think a lot of people assume that if you identify as non-binary, or that if you sit in the middle, that you have to present in a way that you haven't, like in the opposite way that what you've been socialized as. And I've experimented with masculinity. I sometimes feel like masculinity does fit me sometimes, but more often I just enjoy femininity, or like what we assume as femininity, because I find it in our culture and society much more expressive. I do drag, so I love, and I do hyper femininity as performance, because I think it's quite powerful as someone who has experienced the world as being perceived as a woman and being perceived as a person of color, and being put in situations where I feel like what people are perceiving of me, my femininity, is like put me in positions for feeling vulnerable. And so I find it personally really powerful to go out and go, I'm going to perform this aspect. And I really think about it, and it's a whole process for me. And people just assume that I haven't deconstructed gender expression, or that people just assume my gender all the time. And I'm like, no, all of these things are incredibly like thought through and like a decision for me to make. And I find it really disempowering when people try and make that decision for me, and people don't listen to me when I assert what my pronouns are and how I like to express myself. So yeah, that's so I think to sort of end this and what you can do, I think you really need to start thinking about how you can take away this idea of gender expression from like how someone experiences gender as being very different things.
Thanks, Kat. And for anyone who hasn't seen Kat's drag, it is absolutely incredible. I don't know how anyone could think that you hadn't meticulously thought about every single part of it, but I cannot recommend highly enough. Kat's one of the best drag queens, or drag performers, sorry, that I have ever seen. So amazing, stunning, absolutely.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks for the plug.
Anytime,
like I really am not here to promote my drag, but like
no, I'm here to promote it, Kat. All right, great. Our next question is, as ANU alumni, what were your experiences as gender diverse students at ANU, and what lessons does ANU still need to learn? I feel like maybe Lynne, you were a student most recently, if we can call on you.
Too much to add, because I was only actually at ANU for 1 year for a master's degree, and it was kind of half-half. As in terms of my course itself, the people I was working with, that was excellent. I, went through socially changing my name during the process, and everyone was really supportive with that, and it was a great environment. In terms of the campus itself, I didn't spend much time as a postgraduate student getting embroiled in the culture, and I don't have all the experiences undergraduates get to do, but I did find that I knew there was a queer house, but it seemed off in the corner, when previously at my undergraduate university, there was, it was big, centered in the campus center, and a big social place. People were always at, there was lots of activities. And I said, I'm not sure how true that is of ANU because I didn't experience it myself, but having a good place to be seemed like a really good thing at a university. And if it needs to be improved at ANU, I'd say that's a good priority.
Thanks, Lynne. Would anyone else like to jump in with this question? Okay, our next question is, Toby, who is your transgender hero? Thanks for asking, anonymous attendee. So my trans hero is Lou Sullivan, who I have a tattoo of on my arm here, sitting sexily on a chair. And Lou Sullivan is sort of the granddaddy of trans masc rights. And particularly Lou Sullivan is responsible for us being aware that you can be a trans dude and also be feminine, and or also be attracted to dudes, because prior to Lou Sullivan's activist work, people were like, oh, you're a trans man, you must be like a burly, rugged, bearded man who loves women, which is great for some trans people, but is not everyone's experience. So Lou Sullivan pioneered that work and wrote a really amazing, it had a really amazing records of his diaries, and they were published as an amazing book called We Both Laughed in Pleasure, which is basically about Lou Sullivan, Lou Sullivan's whole life, but especially, his joy and his happiness, and his different experiences with transitioning, and having lots of sex and things like that. So Lou Sullivan, absolute icon. Highly recommend his book if anyone loves reading. Our next question, and this is also a question that I have, is Kat, can you tell us more about the musical, and can we see it, please? I added the place.
I'd love for people to be able to see it. However, COVID pending. So the musical, yeah, I mean, look, it was completely original. We sort of all created it together, and it was a group of 6 amazing artists and musicians from Canberra. And we debuted it earlier this year at Tuggeranong Arts Centre. And look, we are really hoping to tour it next year if we can secure some funding. I'm currently on the lookout for a trans director. I did a lot of the sort of producing elements of the show, but I really feel like if we can find a trans director, that will really like solidify this project into something we can tour to some of the fringe festivals and stuff. So, I mean, if you want to find out more, there's I think there's an ABC article online about it somewhere. The musical is called Lost in Transit, of course. I know, what else? But you can find out more about it probably from that article. And look, fingers crossed, I really do want to bring it back, but it is dependent on COVID and if we can get some grant funding secured. So yeah.
I'm crossing every limb that I have. I'm going to ask my dog to cross her limbs. Like, I just want to see the musical. Thank you, Kat.
It's very wholesome, the musical.
I'm so excited. And our last question from our audience is, how can we create a safe space in the workplace for transgender and gender diverse communities?
I think that Toby, it often depends on someone being a leader, I think, in that area. I think especially in Canberra, where so many of us actually work in the public service. I don't, but where so many of us works in the public service, what often happens in the department really can often depend a lot on what the leadership does. But there's a lot of things we can do to challenge, I think, the ethos within the department as well. So I've certainly come across things like pride networks and so on. And even if they won't allow a pride network tea in the Department of Defense, the fact that the pride network exists and that this becomes front page news, actually provides a little bit of embarrassment to the government, and actually I suppose, creates a sense of solidarity among other people in the Pride network. So I think, get together with your allies and actually create, in that environment where you've got a large workplace, get together with your allies, get together other people in the LGBTI community and create, your organization. Within smaller spaces, I think it's often, talking to your employer, and, you can, if necessary, can often get various outside organizations involved, like Agenda, and Meridian go around doing cultural training sessions, for organizations, and so you can get them involved and try to educate the workplace.
Great, thanks, Clara. I think that's a really great suggestion. Like my work has a Pride network and a Pride working group. There's two different things, and just the power of being like, the gays didn't like it, do better, like that. Obviously, the gays in the broader sense of the word, but like having that power to be like, we're a group, we're organized queers, and we want things is really, really powerful. And having that awareness of learning together, and like, because a lot of this stuff is new for people. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like, cool, we need to move from the not knowing to the learning together. Would anyone else like to add anything for this question about the workplace?
Sure, I have a few thoughts, especially on the back end of the workplace. Around making it easier to change your name, gender, honorifics. Don't make them compulsory. Don't assume them. Make them easy to change. And maybe not. I'm not sure how much in the workplace, but I found a lot in job applications. They have a name field and a preferred name field, and then they email you with your name rather than the preferred name, which is a bit of an annoying thing. And as well, from a words, one of my friends is really fighting to, when you've got your leave policies, a lot of companies are making the move to include health leave for transition reasons, and that's a really good thing workplaces do can support, so that you can have time off when you need to go get surgery and need that time to recover, and have your workplace support you through that time.
Yeah, thanks, Lynne. That's a wonderful point, and I think that's so important for workplaces to make that part of their leave entitlements, but also like that they actually talk to trans people about it, because some people will be like, oh, you can have like 5 days, and it's like, really? What are you going to do in 5 days, buddy? Like, it's really important to be, I guess, consulting with trans people about that kind of policy as well. Okay, so that's the end of our questions for today. Before I hand back to Jacob to wrap us up, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists, Kat, Clara and Lynne. It's been an absolute pleasure having a chat with you today, and I especially would like to thank you for bringing a really intersectional lens to a lot of our conversation, because that's so important for the trans community to kind of be thinking about everyone, because we're not free until we're all free. So with that, I'd like to again say thank you, and thank you to our audience for coming along and giving us really nice questions to answer. That's all from me. Back to you, Jacob.
Cool. Thank you, Toby, and the panels. For me personally, as someone growing up in Malaysia, it was almost impossible to see, someone. Oops. Sorry, my video was off. So as I was saying, as someone growing up in Malaysia, it was very hard for me to see, I guess, trans representation in the media and things like that. So even for today, it's amazing. I've learned so much from the discussion, like as someone was saying just now, being an ally, what does that mean? Doing your own research, trying to understand, practice your empathy. And I think one more thing that I've learned from this is be okay to feel that, something that I know about trans previously was wrong, and now I'm learning a new thing about it and put that and, practicing that sort of like, I think, learning attitude. So I just want to share that, and thank you so much for this wonderful session. To close the event, I would like to encourage you to basically support the Eugene Kim Baker Emergency Bursary. As you all know, this Alumni Network webinar is in honor of the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And this bursary honors Eugene deep care for people by offering support to students in difficult times. So another thing, all of this information about this bursary is available on the ANU website. So just go into the website, and I believe after this webinar, you will receive some information around the bursary as well. And thank you for your time today. And I hope you will join us for more activities in 2022. Have a wonderful day.